You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
400 years ago, a trio of tiny kingdoms were perched on some damp islands off the coast of Europe. Within 3 short centuries, these islands would become the centre of an empire which ruled a quarter of the globe and on which the sun never set. I'm Samuel Hume, a historian of the British Empire, and my podcast Pax Britannica follows the people and events that built that empire into a global superpower. Learn the history of the British Empire by listening to Pax Britannica everywhere you find your podcasts, or go to pod.link/pax.
Hello everyone and welcome to another set of older member episodes that are being released here on the main episode feed. This series of episodes covers the interwar Royal Navy, which seemed appropriate as the podcast is about to start its episodes on the Battle of Britain. In fact, that's what I'm working on right now, which is why you're hearing this. There will be 6 episodes in total released over the next 6 weeks as I get this next series on the Battle of Britain kind of sorted out, prepared, and ready for release. Thank you for your patience, and here's the episode. Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, Members Episode 14, The Royal Navy Part 4, Building Better Battleships. In the years before the Second World War, the Royal Navy would spend a staggering amount of money on new ships. They did this because their goal was to match the fleets that both the Germans and Japanese were in the process of building. For the Germans, that meant the 3 Deutschland-class pocket battleships, the 2 Scharnhorst-class battleships, and the Bismarck and Tirpitz. These ships were well known due to the terms of the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, which required the Germans to share their building programs. Now, the Germans were not entirely truthful about the size of the ships or the exact details, but the existence of the ships was well known. The plans for the Japanese were far more ambiguous, but the British knew that they were also expanding their navy and had started construction on at least 2 large battleships. What they did not know was that these would be the Yamato and Musashi, which were far larger than anything that the British would build before or during the war. To try and match this construction, money had to be spent, not just on the ships themselves, but also on a whole host of auxiliary items. New construction facilities, both in the royal dockyards and with private ship construction companies, had to be created and updated. Contracts had to be signed with Czechoslovakia to provide more armor plate because it was simply impossible to create enough domestically. The goal of all of these efforts, as stated in 1937, was to build an aircraft carrier and 2 battleships per year from 1938 to 1942. Today we're going to look at this planned building program, starting with the biggest part of that construction, the King George V battleships. Due to when the war would start, they would be the most modern and powerful Royal Navy ships afloat during the war years. We will then discuss what would have been their successors, the Lion class, which were derailed by the start of the war. As with all of the other armed forces in Britain during this period, the Royal Navy was provided with a massive increase in funding to make its rearmament programs a reality, with the naval budget in 1938 moving up to £94 million, and almost doubling from the early years of the decade. It also represented a large increase from the previous year, which had already been a big bump from the year before. Basically, the instant that the London Treaty was signed in March 1936, naval spending was reevaluated, and 3 supplementary budgets, which all increased naval spending, would make their way through Parliament during the year. The eventual total for the 36-37 budget year was £81 million, $20 million more than the year before. The next year would be 37-38, and there would be another increase, this time up to $94 million, although the Navy would initially request $105. These were massive jumps for the Royal Navy and reversed almost 20 years of stringent budget control. The problem was, at least from a military perspective, they were matched by almost every other nation. Each nation did their budgeting differently, so direct comparisons are challenging, but if we look roughly at the difference between the 1936 and 1938 budgets, we see massive increases in every other major naval power. The Royal Navy would boost spending from $60 million to $94 million, a 56% increase. The United States would increase by roughly 16%, Italy would increase by 42%, Germany would more than double its spending, and Japan would almost triple. This kind of puts British spending in better perspective because even with an increase of 70%, they were still not matching the percent increase from their naval rivals, particularly those powers most likely to be on the other side of a conflict. Now granted, the Royal Navy budget of $60 million was a fair bit more than many of the other nations in 1936, but at the same time, even at that level, the Royal Navy felt barely able to meet its worldwide commitments that only the United States could come even close to matching. The King George V class of battleships is really interesting because it involves all of the attempts of the Royal Navy to push for greater size restrictions on battleships, while also intersecting with the failure of those attempts and the very specific beliefs that the Royal Navy had on what made a good capital ship. When the treaty system began to collapse, the designs that had been made for British battleships built around 12-inch guns and smaller displacements were discarded. Instead, the next class would have a 35,000-ton limit, the largest allowable under the treaty. There was never any real possibility of this construction not happening as well because it was believed with so many other nations building large battleships, the British had to build their own in response. This was a period when the ability of air power to deal with capital ships was uncertain, being in late 1936, which is when these decisions were being made. And so the only viable answer to enemy battleships seemed to be more of their own. Battleships were also a source of national pride, which was a major reason that some of these ships were built, like the Bismarck in Germany, and there were similar reasons for the Royal Navy. I also like this bit of information from Mark Connolly from British Battleships and British Society, 1920 to 1960. Quote, "Battleship building was incredibly important to local communities. For example, in 1939, it was announced that after the launching of King George V from Armstrong Works on the Tyne, that another battleship would be ordered. This led to an article in the Newcastle Journal that put that into perspective, spending £12 million locally, 70% of which would go to wages, and at least 6,000 men would be employed on the hull and machinery alone." End quote. These were big ships and therefore massive construction projects and were important to local economies for obvious reasons. One of the first items that had to be decided on when it came to the design of the ship was the size of the guns that it would carry. There were a whole bunch of different designs with different guns from 14 to 16 inches. The British already had some experience with 16-inch guns, which were what was mounted on the Nelson class back in the 1920s, but the new design was quite a divergence from the Nelson, and so a wider rethink of the guns was permitted. The fact that the Germans would inform the British that they were going to use 15-inch guns on the Bismarck did cause a moment of pause, but the decision was still made to move forward with the initial plans for 14 inches. The reasoning for this was threefold. The first was that they could fire quicker, the second was that the weight savings from smaller guns would allow for more armor to be fitted, and the third was based around the expected engagement ranges of the ships. Firing quicker is a pretty obvious advantage, with the British believing that they could also be more accurate, a claim that seems mostly to be based on the idea that the Royal Navy was simply better at shooting, although which is, somewhat dubious. The second, allowing more weight to be devoted to armor, was important. With the King George designs, the British put a lot of emphasis on armor, and armor took weight. To put it in perspective a bit, the ships would have 6,000 tons less total displacement than the Bismarck, but they would have more armor. The British ships would also be better armored in all areas than the American ships that they would later fight beside. With the desire to stay within that 35,000-ton limit, which was an idea that was never really questioned, if only because other nations were claiming to have stuck with it with their designs, even if they were not, more weight being devoted to the armor meant less that was available for the guns. The third piece of the reasoning was the expected engagement ranges, which would affect both guns and armor. From the gun perspective, the smaller guns would have a shorter maximum engagement range when compared to the ships that they might be called upon to face. But the Royal Navy believed that in any engagement, they would be trying to get within 18,000 yards of the enemy ship anyway, which was well within the operational limits of any of the guns being considered. This also affected the specific layout of the armor, especially around the armor belt on the side of the ship, which was far more vertical than many of its contemporaries due to these ideally short engagement ranges, which would see shells coming in at a far lower angle. As we discussed last episode, there were discussions about possibly changing the guns to a larger caliber, but this was abandoned due to it being simply too late in the design process to make such a major change. This was partially because the designs would actually receive their final stamp of approval on May 28, 1936, and then by October the final plan drawings had been approved. The first two ships were then laid down on January 1st, 1937, the first day after the treaties expired. So any design changes had to happen before January 1st, 1937, and in enough time for everything to be changed. While there had been serious efforts to keep them within the 35,000-ton limit, with seemingly every other capital ship during the interwar period, they would also end up being overweight. The King George V would clock in at a bit over 36,000 tons. The two ships laid down at the start of 1937 would be the King George V and the Prince of Wales. There were some discussions about making them the only ships of their class, with some more drastic changes suggested for the ships that were scheduled to begin during the next year's building program. This was something that the Royal Navy had some experience with before the First World War, where some classes of dreadnoughts were only constructed for a year before meaningful changes were made for the next year. However, this was not the path that was pursued after 1937, due primarily to the fact that if any real changes were made, the construction rate could not be maintained, and if none were made, then it could even maybe be improved. Major changes would meet some delay, which was seen as simply unacceptable as the world seemed to be moving closer and closer to some sort of conflict. After the King George V class was under construction, eyes began shifting to the next set of British battleships. The new set of ships would be built under the escalated Washington Treaty limits because in early June 1937, the United States asked all of the signatories about their building programs. The Japanese made it clear that they would not obey the limitations of the treaty, which were still 14-inch guns and 35,000 tons displacement. With the Japanese openly refusing these limits, although to be very clear, many nations were also planning to scale up their next set of ships, every navy had to reevaluate their future plans. The rumor that was going around at this time was that the Japanese were building a ship with 18-inch guns, and there were reports given to both the Royal Navy and the American Navy to that effect. While these reports were taken seriously, there was also a level of skepticism that the Japanese could make a large jump in caliber for their ships that were, going to be built in 1937. They could at the same time not be wholly discounted, and the rumors and the reluctance of the Japanese to stick to the previously agreed upon limits meant that escalation had to happen. One piece of the naval agreements that is often de-emphasized is that there was the belief that even if the Japanese did not sign the full agreement and agree to the prescribed force ratios, they would at least stick to the size limitations. This belief was based on the assumption in London and Washington that the Japanese would not want to enter a size-based building war with either nation. Therefore, the theory went, they would stick to the size limitations out of fear of what the other nations could and would build. Or as the Committee of Imperial Defense would say, if the Japanese went forward with larger ships, they would invoke the escalator clause and, quote, then make use of our far greater building capacity and financial strength to ensure that the outcome of such an action would be entirely to Japan's disadvantage, end quote. Of course, this was the exact reasoning that the Japanese would use when choosing to go so big with the Yamato and Musashi, believing that since they could never hope to quantitatively outbuild the other nations, they had to make sure that the ships that they did build were very large and very powerful.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts, guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place. For changes big and small. Loud or quiet. Find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
In the end, the British, French, and Americans would meet in London on March 29, 1937, and send the official notification to Tokyo that they were escalating. The escalation clause, once activated, caught both Washington and London behind a step. For the Americans, they were building their North Carolinas, which were, at least in theory, on that 35,000-ton limit. They would not be able to make a full post-treaty ship until the Iowa class, which would be closer to 45,000 tons. For the British, they had just started 2 King George V's and planned to start 3 more the next year, which would be the 37-38 fiscal year. Because they had decided to stick with the original design for the 3 follow-on ships, they could not now change, meaning that their earliest reply would come when the ships that would be laid down in the 1938-39 fiscal year. There were some concerns about this fact, but the Royal Navy still believed that it could outbuild the Japanese in these new and larger ships, even if they were a few months behind. This meant that at the very worst, they would end up with 5 very capable battleships that were more than a match for any pre-treaty ships that any of the navies may have, even those that were heavily modernized. A more detailed story of the entire course of the events for the King George V class during the war is well beyond the scope of this episode, but overall it was positive. There were problems identified with the design. One of the most interesting ones, at least in my mind, were the endurance problems that the ships would have during operations, which I find interesting because, British Empire all over the world and all that. Basically, the British just allowed for less fuel storage than similar ships, and they got less miles out of every ton of fuel. The reason they were less efficient was due to another interesting decision that had been made during the design process to favor speed of design and production over performance. Basically, during the late 1930s, many of the navies around the world were increasing the temperatures and pressures in their steam power generation plants in their naval vessels. This provided greater efficiency in fuel consumption, but introduced many technical problems that had to be solved, and the British simply did not feel confident in solving them. This meant that the King George V and other ships designed at this time would always be at a disadvantage when it came to fuel efficiency, which was noticeable during the war. But given the commissioning dates of the 5 ships, it's hard to argue that speed of construction was not the correct move. Any serious delay would have meant that the ships would have missed the war, or more likely would have been cancelled when the war began. So the problem in this case isn't the decision to go with the sort of lower pressure steam. The problem was actually years earlier when they had failed to perfect the high temperature, high pressure versions of their steam power generation plants. Speaking of cancelled when the war started though, that brings us nicely to the next set of British capital ships, the Lion class. The Lion class was the Royal Navy's answer to the American Iowa class or the Japanese super battleships. Due to budgetary concerns, after the burst of building of the 5 King George V's in 2 years, the Lions would be spread out with 2 laid down in 39, 1 in 40, and 1 in 41. There was some hope that this could be accelerated slightly, and the ship that would eventually become the Vanguard, which we'll discuss here in a bit, came out of this desire to do a 3-ship year in 1939. This was eventually approved by the cabinet due to the speed at which the German Navy was expanding, with concern that if they accelerated that building during the year, they would catch the British off guard. The Lions were planned to be about 40,000 tons, although I'm quite skeptical that they would have met that number, given how frequently capital ship displacement ballooned during this period. They would have mounted 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, much like the American Iowas. The design was finalized in December 1938, and the first 2 ships of the class, the Lion and Temeraire, would be laid down in the summer of 1939, Lion in July, Temeraire in June. The original plan was for the construction to take 4 years or so, and so they would join the fleet in 1943, but problems with meeting this schedule began to appear immediately. This was a period of massive rearmament for the British Armed Forces, and there were some industries that found the demands very challenging. The 2 most important areas when it came to the Lion class was the production of armor plate and the construction of gun mountings. The capacity for British industry to create armor plate, which was necessary for warships, was severely strained by the orders being placed in the 1930s. The official estimates from the government was that there was enough capacity for the construction of 2.5 capital ships per year, but even this was proving to be overly optimistic. There had been attempts to solve this problem by placing massive orders for armor plate with the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia. This was a good plan. Skoda could create what was needed, but unfortunately, very little of that was delivered by Skoda before Czechoslovakia was taken over by the Germans. The other problem, gun mountings, was almost more problematic. They took a lot of time and they were very complicated to make, and so there were simply a fixed number that could be produced per year. Just before the outbreak of the war, the third ship, which would have been the Conqueror, was ordered, while the fourth ship, Thunderer, was ordered in November 1939. However, it was on that very same day that work on the Lion and Temeraire was massively deprioritized. Given all of the other construction that was happening, this essentially ended their construction. Then in May 1940, all work on the Lions was halted as focus was placed primarily on smaller ships, especially destroyers and other convoy escorts. There would be only one battleship completed by the Royal Navy after the King George V class, and that was the Vanguard. Vanguard is an interesting ship because it was originally not planned at all, but it would be a solution to the desire of the Royal Navy to build more battleships during that 1937-1938 period. The primary reason that Vanguard was even possible was because two ships that had been planned as large cruisers would be converted into aircraft carriers. This was the Courageous and Glorious. However, this conversion was made after construction had started, and importantly, after the 4 twin 15-inch gun mounts had been created. With these spare parts essentially planned for nothing, the designers at the Admiralty got to work on creating plans for how to modify the King George V design to fit 4 twin turrets. The ship would be laid down in December 1940, and it would take a little over 4 years before it was delivered. During that time, construction was paused, then restarted, then paused again, and then put into maximum priority so that it finished in early 1944. There had been some discussions about converting it to an aircraft carrier along the way, with the suggestion being abandoned after it was decided that it would make a very poor aircraft carrier, especially in comparison to all the purpose-built carriers that were the norm during the war years. As the ship was being built, as many lessons from the war were incorporated into changes into the design as was possible, and most of them can be summarized as putting as many anti-aircraft guns as possible onto the ship. This became far more important after the loss of the Prince of Wales in December 1941. Vanguard would be far from the only ship to get an augmented anti-aircraft armament during the war, as pretty much every ship would get the same treatment during any major refit. While we know today that Vanguard would be the last battleship ever built for the Royal Navy, they of course did not know this at the time, and so with the war still ongoing, they were already considering what their next move would be. During the first half of the war, there was the belief that it was always possible that the construction on the Lion class might resume. But even when space became available for that to happen, early in 1942 with American entry into the war, instead a program for light aircraft carriers was decided to be more important. In April 1943, this was made official, with the armor that had been held and waiting for the Lions being disposed of. This pushed planning from possible design alterations for the Lions, while they were under construction, to an entirely new set of ships. These plans were drawn up and would pull from all the lessons learned from the war, with the design being based around a ship that was 50,000 tons and which had 9 16-inch guns. There were updates to underwater protection, primarily focused around concerns of aerial torpedo attack. There was a whole lot more anti-aircraft armament and better directors and things to make it more efficient in that role. But by that point, such ships were already a very hard sell, and would be a non-starter even before the war was over and drastic budget cuts were made. In the end, the battleship concept was already dead by the time that these final designs were drafted.